Zack Polanski is riding high in the polls, and the Greens have now breached 175,000 members. But the harder task for Polanski will be persuading skeptics of his ideas for the country. And to that end, he laid out his argument for a wealth tax this weekend on Sunday with Laura Kuenssberg.
If you go back, say, a million minutes, you get back to the beginning of 2023. Most people can probably remember what they were doing at the beginning of 2023. If you go back a billion minutes, you get to the Roman Empire. That's the difference in inequality in this country. So I'm talking about multimillionaires and billionaires paying their fair share. Now, it's important to say, people will say, does that raise enough? Is it just about raising revenue? That's not actually the point. Of course, the money is important. Well, the real point is about tackling inequality.
So you've got, a good analogy about how big a billion is. Obviously, it's difficult to sort of imagine these numbers. Having £1 billion is unnecessary for anyone. We should be taxing people with £1 billion. Zack Polanski there also, I suppose, trying to preempt the argument that's been made against wealth taxes, which is that the ones that have been proposed won't raise that much money. So sort of the estimations sort of vary between sort of around 10 billion and 25 billion, which is between 1% and 2% of government spending. So you can't say, there are no spending constraints on the government because we can just tax wealth, because none of the wealth taxes proposed radically change the position of the government. That doesn't mean we should do them. We should do them. But he's saying we should do it to tackle inequality, not necessarily because it will raise lots of money. Now, let's look at how Laura Kuenssberg followed that up.
The point then for you of putting up tax on the very wealthy is to try to stop them being as wealthy. It's not actually to raise money for schools and hospitals and public services.
We can raise that money anyway. What it's about is the fact that if you have that much money, if you're a billionaire, you can't spend it quickly, even if you try. So you hoard it in assets. And it's the assets that are the problem here, because that's exacerbating the inequality that already exists. But what we need to do is get that money and those assets flowing around the economy.
But how do you raise that money anyway if it's not through taxation?
Well, there's a few ways. So Sharon was exactly right earlier when she's talking about borrowing to invest. That's one way. But also there's something called spending multipliers, which is where you invest in the economy, say the National Health Service. You get that money back because you have a well population. Now, of course, it's important that people are healthy just to be healthy. But actually, if you cut through austerity, that's a completely false economy. You have people missing work, you have more long-term health conditions, and you break the economy in the way that we've seen both Conservative governments do it and Labour government now too.
But you say there you can borrow. The government's already borrowing enormous amounts, and there is an already massive amount of national debt. And it's way more than the government spends every year, and it costs a fortune to pay the interest on that debt. So would you not put any limits on government borrowing?
Well, the first thing to say is debt to GDP ratio is at 100%. In Japan, it's 270%, and they have much better living standards than we do.
But in terms of this country, it's at the highest level it's been for a very, very long time. The financial markets are very sensitive to the decisions that the Chancellor makes. That's the case whether you'd like it or not. The UK's already got huge levels of debt. So are you suggesting that actually you'd be relaxed about the government borrowing much, much more?
Well, I think Andy Burnham was really interesting recently when he said we need to stop being in hock to the bond markets. And I think
there was a market reaction.
Well, exactly. So what I think we need to do is get back to a place where actually democratic politicians who are elected by the people are more worried about the cleaners, the teachers, the nurses, the people on the ground who are actually creating the economy with their hands, rather than the people who hold these assets, who are making money while they sleep without actually working. That's deeply problematic. Now, are the markets important? Of course, they play a role, but much more important is the trust of the public on the politicians that they democratically elect. And we've gone so far the other way.
So those statements about not having to worry too much about borrowing, especially when it comes to spending on the NHS, got a lot of negative attention online. So the former head of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, so probably sort of the most mainstream economics think tank in the country, said, very worrying coming from the leader of an increasingly popular party. The populism of far left and far right have much in common, pretending there are simple answers, no economic constraints, and always others to blame and others who will pay. David Gauke, who was a Treasury Minister during the austerity years, so not a great economic record himself, he said this: Zack Polanski's economic approach is extraordinarily ignorant and dangerous. The economist on Laura Kuenssberg's panel, was also critical. Andy Haldane is the former chief economist at the Bank of England.
When you hear Zack Polanski say, basically, we can borrow almost as much as we want in a different way, the markets have got too much power, we shouldn't be in hock to them, as Andy Burnham suggests, is that because it might sound appealing to lots of people. Their polling suggests it's really appealing to lots of people. How does it sound to your ears?
It's la-la land economics. Let's be
La-la land.
I'm a man at the Bank of England. I presided over almost £1 trillion of money printing. If that was the route to success and growth, would have long since solved this problem. This is not the time for funny money solutions. We need to invest, and that is the only route, I think, to getting back to growth.
But you do think, Andy, that we should change our fiscal rules and loosen them, don't you? So, of course, that's what we're talking about, that actually the fiscal rules can be loosened to borrow, to invest.
So the £1 trillion that he was involved in printing, that was quantitative easing after the 2008 financial crisis, and then the money that was printed during the COVID pandemic. And Andy Haldane saying, I've done money printing. It's one, it didn't rescue the economy, and also it's not going to work very well now. Now's not the time for funny money. Andy Haldane then was representing the dominant view in economics, the mainstream view in economics. Not everyone agrees, though. Daniela Gabor is Professor of Economics at SOAS and recently debated Andy Haldane in a podcast for the London Review of Books. So I wanted to ask her what she felt about that, so the Andy Haldane and Zack Polanski trading blows there.
I was quite, in some ways, amused and surprised by the reaction that Andy Haldane gave to this, because I think in some ways it dismissed a relatively complex economic argument that Zack Polanski was making under kind of unfriendly fire from Laura Kusenberg about how we should think about borrowing, how we should think about the government spending, and he dismissed it as in, this is la-la land economics. What we need to do now is, the British government has to demonstrate to the public and to the bond markets that it can rein in spending. And I think it sort of, and this interpretation that Haldane had is not just his, it's pretty pervasive in certain areas of the British commentariat and the punditry. It dismisses the progressive narrative that Zack Polanski is trying to shape, and he's a kind of lonely voice there, is dismissing it as this guy wants to borrow indefinitely, he wants free lunches, he doesn't understand how economics works, and don't take him seriously. And if your viewers have seen the clip already, I think he's given quite a careful answer where what he's trying to do is to say, we in Britain have, even since the 2008 global financial crisis, we have lived with this political narrative of a dichotomy between the bond markets and the government. George Osborne had this dichotomy. Keir Starmer has this dichotomy. Andy Haldane in some ways operates with this dichotomy that says the government has to make sure that it doesn't displease the bond markets, that its bond markets are some kind of vigilantes. There is a whole term coined during the Clinton administration, the bond vigilantes, these financiers that sit there, they look at the spending plans of a government, they look at the tax plans of a government, and they either give a seal of approval or they don't. And government should be really, really stressed about this. And what Polanski did is to say this dichotomy actually is not how the relationship or macroeconomics works in the UK. There is a third factor, which is the Bank of England. This Bank of England is very important because it has bought government bonds on a massive scale, very aggressively during what we call the period of quantitative easing, is now selling and has been selling for a while government bonds at a very aggressive scale. It's the most aggressive central bank in the world, and it's creating very significant fiscal costs for the government. So Polanski, in some ways, has a much more, they dismiss him as an kind of ignoramus that doesn't understand and lives in la-la land economics, but he has in some ways a more sophisticated understanding. Okay, you can't go in an interview on the BBC and start to explain the mechanics of the relationship between the central bank and the government, but he's trying his best to say it's not so simple. And even if it was this simple, when you talk about bond market investors, the story is far more complicated. And maybe we can come back to this, because I usually tell people to read Tobin Angle, who used to be a bond market, a gilt market investor, and he says the best compliment that the bond market can pay to a government's spending plans is a mild sell-off. So seeing prices increasing is a compliment that says the market thinks the growth plan is going to work.
Let's. I want to park the Bank of England and bond markets just for one moment because that's what we'll spend most of the interview discussing. But I suppose the thing that I thought Andy Haldane might have been referring to when he said funny money, and why this one of the reasons this caused controversy is not just something that divides the right from the left or the centre from the left, but also a big debate within the left, because there are people sort of on the MMT wing, so Richard Murphy and people like that, who sort of say taxes don't finance spending. There isn't really that much of a, like, maybe there's a limit when it comes to inflation, but we shouldn't get too hung up whatsoever about the idea that you need to raise taxes to increase spending. And then there are people like Gary Stevenson who say, look, this sort of monetary policy of printing money, it hasn't worked in the past. It's not going to work again. The only way that we're going to deal with the problem this country has is by taxing the rich to improve the fiscal situation of the government. And I suppose I wonder where you come in there. And I suppose for me, what I was a bit confused by is this idea that spending on the NHS will pay for itself because it will make the population more healthy. Like, I'm obviously in favour of spending more on the NHS, but I feel like you're probably going to have to tax people more to spend more on the NHS because that's current spending. I don't know, where do you stand on that?
Okay, thank you. You're cutting to the heart of the problem. I would say that relying on or invoking MMT, modern money theory, in the current political context is not a very wise political strategy, and I discourage anybody from trying to do so. I think we have to be very clear that MMT is first a description of the mechanics of the relationship between the central bank and the government, and the moment in which, and it says basically, if the government has an account at the central bank, when it spends, it basically injects more money in the economy. And when it taxes, it sucks out money from the economy. Now, there are many added complications to this because the government might not have an account at the central bank, or it might be restricted in the way that it uses, as it is in the UK, with this account at the central bank. So to me, it's not very useful a framing to now go and say, if with this institutional arrangement, then we don't need to think about taxes. I think we have to think about taxation. And I think not only to think about taxation as a question of, are we able to raise revenue for the kinds of things that we need to spend on, but are we able to use taxation as a tool for inequality, to manage inequalities in the British economy? And to me, what Zack Polanski has done is to say, well, I would like to focus more on the second, on taxation as a kind of redistributive tool rather than a fiscal spend instrument. I am not very, I'm not very concerned about, we say, oh, you know, all you need to do is spend and everything will be great. That's not the institutional arrangement that we have in the UK. So having said that, the second part, the idea that monetary policy or printing money is either inherently inflationary because it creates asset price inflation, or it goes into the pockets of the rich one way or another. I think also that's a view that requires nuance, in the sense of, if you look at the Bank of England printing money, or funny money, I don't want to call it funny money, and I'm surprised that Andy Haldane calls it funny money, because he was at the Bank of England when the bank was printing this funny money. But most of what the Bank of England has done is to buy large quantities of government bonds, of gilts, both after the global financial crisis and during the COVID pandemic. At some point, at the height of the COVID pandemic, the Bank of England was holding up to 50% of the overall stock of government bonds issued by the British government. Now, the question is not, should the central bank buy these government bonds, make life easier or not in terms of what is the interest rate at which government spends? The question always is, what is the government spending on? And is it spending on some kind of overall strategy that can generate productivity improvement, that can generate, I would say, economic growth of some sort, and that can generate economic competitiveness. So to me, the question is always not just how do we finance, but what is it for? As for, and I'm going to stop here, as for the question of, if we spend more on the NHS, will that create more fiscal space? I'm not sure he said exactly that, but now trying to unpick what a guy said during a 3-minute interview is complicated. The way that I understood it and the way that I would like to understand it is to say, we have in Britain a problem of long-term illness that keeps people out of the labor market. That problem of long-term illness is to some extent due to the shortages of capacity in the NHS to deal with long-term illness. And I know this because I am a long-term ill person. I have long COVID, and I'm only able to manage the workload because I'm in academia and I can work throughout the day. But if I had to be standing on my feet from 9 to 5 every day, I would be unemployed. And the NHS does not offer support for people like me. This I know very well because I've tried very hard to get it. So what Zack Polanski is saying, to me, the way that I want to read him is to say, if we get people like Daniela and people who would like to work, who are desperate to work because they don't want to be sitting at home on very low, if I was unemployed, the unemployment benefits are very low. If we want to get people like Daniela back into the labor market, we need to fund public services that allow her to go there. But Daniela and people like Daniela getting into the labor market would mean increasing productivity, increasing tax revenues, increasing economic activity. In my case, hopefully better educated students because I'm in a university job. That's all he's saying. He's saying it pays for itself in the sense that I don't need to get unemployment benefits and I'm contributing to the overall level of economic activity in a country.
Let's move away from the exact wording of what Zack Polanski sort of said in any formulation of any one sentence. And I actually want to move to what Andy Haldane said, because I suppose to steel man his case, he wasn't saying funny money is always wrong. He said he specifically said, like, I'm the guy at the Bank of England I was the guy at the Bank of England when they printed one trillion pounds. So he says, I'm all in, I recognize that sometimes very expansionary monetary policy is necessary. But he's saying now is not the time for funny money. And he's saying now is not the time for funny money because, he didn't really expand, but I would assume he would expand and say because inflation is already quite high, it's not obvious that there is lots of spare capacity in the economy. Interest rates are already quite high. So basically he was saying now's not the time for really expansionary monetary policy, which is not necessarily an unreasonable point, is it?
So it's not... The way that I understand the point about funny money is should a Zack Polanski-led government borrow in order to, and he said very clearly, should he borrow to invest in capital infrastructure investment? And let's remember that 6 months ago, this was the mantra of the Keir Starmer government. They were going to generate massive amounts of public investment because we live in a world where everybody is doing industrial policy, everybody's trying to be more competitive. The British economy cannot fall behind. So I'm not quite sure that this was an argument about expansionary monetary policy as it was an argument about the ways in which a government can transform an economy in an age where everybody is using government tools, from Donald Trump to China to Europe. Everybody is using the government fiscal policy, industrial policy to steer the economy aggressively in one direction or other. And in the case of Britain, we cannot do this, and the Labour government is not doing this on any significant scale. You could say because they don't have a vision and they are centrists, and their idea is, we just let the markets kind of work with a little bit of help from us. But you can also think, okay, they are not doing this because they are afraid of the bond markets. And when you're afraid of the bond markets, you just think in terms of what will the bond market allow me to do, what it will not allow me to do. And I'm not convinced that this argument is correct, because we know that bond markets actually like economies that are in a slow growth or in a slump, because that's when they get more profits. You make profits if the prices of gilts increase when in a low growth scenario. And bond market investors themselves say, and I don't know if I'm repeating myself, that the best compliment that the bond markets can pay to a chancellor is a mild sell-off. So I don't know that Andy Haldane was making an overall judgment about whether we are at full employment, whether there is nothing to be done and we are in a rosy economic situation. I think that's not the case. I think there are very serious long-term problems of the British economy, and the idea that we can't do anything because the bond markets don't let us, I think it's a political dead end. And my worry is that it takes us into the hands of reform, who is very happy to say, oh, we are in a completely wrong place, we have to change things, and we will change them. And this is exactly what people want to hear, and that's exactly what Zack Polanski is also saying.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think Andy Haldane does also say that actually the Labour government should change the fiscal rules so they can borrow more to do capital expenditure and investment. But let's not obsess over the particular wording of particular people. And this general point about the bond markets, because I suppose some of these ideas are a bit new to me. You seem to be suggesting that the bond markets prefer the government outlook to be worse. So why would the bond markets sort of selling off government debt be a compliment? Just, I suppose, I know this is very complex, but try and explain in as simple terms as is possible here.
Look, so I'm quoting here bond market investors, right? Because when I say this, people think, oh, she's just a left-wing economist, and she would say this, of course. But in the British economy, we have not a duo. It's not the bond market against the government. We have a triumvirate, if you want. You have the government bond market, you have the Bank of England, and you have the government and its spending and taxation plans. And why do I keep insisting on this? Because the Bank of England has undertaken since 2023 an aggressive program of what they call quantitative tightening, which is costing the fiscal budget, it's costing the taxpayer somewhere in the region of 140 billion pounds. This is the net fiscal cost estimated by financial market participants. It's 5% of the UK GDP. In the United States is 1.5%. And those costs, that the net losses that you have, and there is a long story, I don't want to bore you with the technicalities, but there are net losses. Those net losses in the US are sitting on the balance sheet of the central bank, of the Federal Reserve. They are not transmitted to the taxpayer. Only in the UK, we put the losses of monetary policy decisions onto the taxpayer. This is an unfair system, and it kind of reflects in some way the political preferences of the governor of the Bank of England and the people around him who are very conservative economists. I think this has to be very clear, that we are living in an economic system in which our political elites, with very few exceptions, prefer to go with a bond market narrative, because this justifies austerity, and it justifies why you can't leave the status quo of we just, play at the margins. So I would say this is an important factor. The Bank of England has to be considered. Now, why do bond markets, and this is why does Tobin Anger, for example, say that bond markets prefer austerity? Because, it's simply a question of how do you think about, or how do bond markets price or make profits from changes in bond prices? And he says that, when there is there is austerity and you have low growth prospects, bond prices increase, investors make money, so they prefer austerity. It's simply a question of the mechanics of profitability. And of course, I'm not saying, and it is possible, and we also always have to think about the trade-offs. It is possible that if you have a fiscal plan that in some way or another doesn't really generate or doesn't have the credibility of a long-term economic strategy, you can have not a mild sell-off, but you can have a gigantic sell-off. And that we have to think about. But this is not where we are at this moment. I don't think there is I can't see how there is a gigantic risk of a sell-off. I look at what Donald Trump has done in the United States. I expected a sell-off there, because this guy is just making things up as he goes along. It's imposing very non-status quo policies, and the government bond market has behaved in some ways better than it has behaved in the UK. So, to me, if we are very clear about what is the political economy and what are the political choices behind the institutional arrangements that we have, then the bond market doesn't allow me to do things. It becomes much more complicated. It becomes, in a sense, the bond markets become a scapegoat for the lack of political will to do proper transformation, to do proper economic policy. And some of them don't even want to be scapegoats. They say, look, you better try to have a growth strategy, and then life would be better for British citizens.
Let me try, just because I know these are very complex sort of concepts. I'm going to take a risk and sort of try explain the argument about quantitative tightening as simply as I can, and you can tell me if and how I'm wrong. So when there was very low demand in the economy, sort of during the COVID pandemic or after 2008, what the central bank did was it bought lots and lots of government bonds. And it bought lots and lots of government bonds because it wanted to push down their price so that private asset holders and private investors would put their money elsewhere, because you can't make much money from government bonds because the interest is so low, because the Bank of England is buying them all up. Now, this happened across the West. So you've got lots of these central banks who are holding lots of government bonds. But what our government has done somewhat uniquely and different to, for example, the US Treasury, is our Bank of England has decided, or our central bank, we're the only ones with a Bank of England, our central bank has decided that now is the time to sell some of those bonds that it bought in the tough times, so that it bought in the early 2010s after 2008 or during the COVID pandemic. It's decided to sell them. And that's putting more pressure on government because it's sort of flooding the market to some degree with bonds, and that's lowering their price, which is increasing the yield. And so our Bank of England is proactively acting in such a manner that the interest rate our government has to pay is higher than it otherwise would be.
Right. So you nearly got it right. The first part is not exactly right, but it's almost right. So the central bank, it is very important. The central bank, after 2008, bought government bond, gilts in the UK, government bonds elsewhere, US treasuries. It bought government bonds because it wanted to reduce the yields on those government bonds, right? It wanted to reduce the yields in order to create what you call this behavioral effect. It wanted investors to move out of low yielding government bonds into higher yielding corporate bonds, because if you reduce the yields on those, then you basically reduce the cost of borrowing for private corporations, you incentivize investment, you get growth going again, right? So that was one reason. The other reason, and this is becoming even more technical, but the politics is in the technicality, so we have to go through this. The other reason why central banks have bought government bonds is because they are fundamental to how the modern financial system works. The government bonds are like, you have to think of it as the lifeblood of the financial system. If government bonds don't work well, if there are very significant disruptions, and you can think about the Liz Truss moment, it had to do not just with the fiscal decisions of the unfunded tax cuts of the Truss government, but it also had to do with the pension fund, the use of gilts for leverage purposes, for trying to get more debt, for trying to get more profit. So central banks bought government bonds because they knew that without stability in the government bond market, you have financial crises, you have financial instability problems. And we even have institutional innovations called the market maker of last resort. And I'm going to finish soon. A market maker of last resort, which is basically says the central bank will stabilize the price and the yield, or the yield, it's the inverse of price. It will stabilize those yields because otherwise the financial system can implode. So there are many reasons, both you can think fiscal reasons and macro financial reasons, why central banks are now commonly intervening in the government bond market, which is kind of counterintuitive to the whole agenda and idea of central bank independence, because central banks are supposed to be independent from government, but they have done so because modern financial markets require to do it. And Bank of England has done it more aggressively. Our quantitative easing has been, in a sense, more aggressive than others. These are all political choices. How much government bonds you buy, how do you hold them, how do you structure it, is a political choice. And after 2020, since 2022, with a price shock from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, plus the cost supply shocks from the pandemic, the Bank of England said, we have inflation. I mean, it's supply side driven, and I don't have the tools to deal with supply side inflationary pressures, because my entire framework is about demand, and it's not a problem of excess demand here. We have a problem of supply and cost shocks. But anyways, since I have this inflation problem and I cannot solve it properly, and Andrew Bailey even said workers should take lower wages because this is everybody else but the Bank of England could solve the inflation problem, they decided to do this process called quantitative tightening. Now, how do you do quantitative tightening? I will finish here. You could say, look, I have, 800 billion worth of government bonds. I bought them. They have different maturities. They can be 1 year, 3 year, 10 year. I can wait for them to expire. right? And then the government basically pays me back. I don't know, Peter pays Paul, but never mind. There is a process of this passive unwinding, it's called in financial markets and in central bank law. So you basically don't do anything. The Bank of England decided to do active unwinding or active quantitative tightening, where it just sells gilts, and it sells gilts. And because it sells gilts, it's competing with the Treasury, who is also trying to issue gilts and find investors, find buyers for these gilts at the same time. So you have the two arms of the state trying to find investors at the same time. Of course, then that puts the price of these bonds, it lowers them, it increases yields. It's an unhappy scenario for the taxpayers, not just because there is this competition, right, for investors between, in a sense, the central bank and the debt management office, the treasury. Let's keep it the Treasury. But there is also the fact that we have designed the quantitative tightening or quantitative easing process to basically move all the revenues and all the costs to the Treasury. It's not the central bank that bears this. In any other large central rich economy in the global north, the central bank says, okay, I have losses, but I will keep these losses on my balance sheet until they basically disappear because I make gains elsewhere. I don't pass them to the Treasury. And even the Bundesbank, which is a super conservative central bank, does not pass the losses from quantitative easing or from quantitative tightening to the government. It says, we central banks can create money out of thin air. We will take these losses ourselves. The UK is unique, and it's not me saying this. It is investors for example, Christopher Mahan from Columbia Threadneedle. He says that the cost of QT will be with us for a very long time, and he blames the Bank of England for the way in which it has designed it.
So you're saying we've got a particularly conservative central bank governor who's making life more difficult for our government than it needs to be because of ideological conservatism, and so presumably Labour should replace him.
Well, saying this is like threatening to throw a bomb inside a very busy airport, because, this looks like the Donald Trump trying to basically completely blow up central bank independence. I think that we have to ask ourselves, why is it that the governor of the Bank of England has such fiscal powers? Why decisions that Bank of England makes about how much the government bond it sells can create or shrink fiscal space? I don't know if you remember, but Rachel Reeves every other week has either 5 more billion or 5 less billion, depending on what the Bank of England wants to do. Why is it that unelected technocrats with a specific ideological preference for a certain monetary theory, why do they make decisions about fiscal positions? This is I would like democratically elected governments to make these decisions about fiscal policy, even if they are wrong. We live in democracy; we have to live with that. But I think it is dangerous to have to not even call into question the fact that a conservative central banker has a set of policy preferences that have fiscal consequences, whereas a more progressive central banker has very different policy preferences. Look at the United States, where Jay Powell, the governor of the US Federal Reserve, has recently said, we will pause quantitative tightening. They do a much weaker passive form of quantitative tightening. Donald Trump made noises about replacing him, and he said, you know what, maybe we'll pause it because we don't want the government bond market to suffer. It is all of it is politics. It's just we have to ask ourselves who does it work for and who does it benefit.